It was December 21st, the longest night of the year, and the world outside was buried under a thick, white blanket of snow. I was driving back to my hometown in upstate New York, hoping to make it in time for my family's annual Christmas Eve dinner. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, with heavy snow falling relentlessly. The roads were slick, visibility was poor, and my car's heater was barely keeping up with the bitter cold. My GPS led me onto a narrow, winding road through dense woods. It wasn't my usual route, but it was supposed to be a shortcut. I noticed the snow falling heavier, the trees looming larger, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like something alive. I had driven this way before during the summer, but in winter it felt like an entirely different world. Silent, desolate, and oppressive. About 20 miles in, my car sputtered and came to a halt. The gas gauge blinked empty. I cursed myself for not refueling earlier. The cold crept in almost immediately, and panic began to set in. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I grabbed my coat, gloves, and flashlight from the back seat. There was a light ahead in the distance, faint and flickering, but unmistakable. It wasn't a street light, though. It looked like it was coming from a house, maybe a cabin. With no other options, I decided to walk toward it. The snow crunched under my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. As I approached, the outline of the structure came into view. It was an old, Victorian-style house, standing incongruously in the middle of nowhere. Its windows were frosted, but dim, golden lights spilled out from behind the heavy curtains. A faint trail of smoke curled from the chimney, signaling warmth inside. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. At first, there was no answer, and I was about to give up when the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her gray hair tied back in a bun, her face lined but kind-looking. She wore a thick woolen shawl and held a lantern in one hand. "You're out here in this storm?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "My car broke down," I explained, my breath visible in the freezing air. "I didn't know where else to go." "Come in, dear," she said, opening the door wider. "You'll freeze out there." The warmth of the house was a relief, and I immediately felt my frozen fingers and toes begin to thaw. The interior was surprisingly well maintained, though it had an old-fashioned charm. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the air smelled faintly of pine and something sweet, like baked goods. "My name's Margaret," she said, leading me to a chair by the fire. "I'll get you some tea to warm you up." "Thank you," I said, still shivering slightly. "I'm so lucky you were here. I don't know what I'd have done otherwise." She gave me a small, tight-lipped smile and disappeared into the kitchen. I took the opportunity to look around. The house was filled with antique furniture and decorations. Porcelain dolls, oil paintings, and lace doilies. A grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly. When Margaret returned, she handed me a steaming mug of tea. I took a sip and immediately felt a comforting warmth spread through me. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. "You can stay the night if you'd like," Margaret said. "I have a spare room upstairs. The storm isn't letting up anytime soon." I hesitated. Something about the house, or perhaps the situation itself, felt off. But what choice did I have? I nodded and thanked her. After finishing the tea, Margaret showed me to the guest room. It was small but cozy, with a four-poster bed and heavy quilts. She wished me good night and closed the door softly behind her. That's when things began to feel truly strange. I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but that wasn't what kept me awake. It was the sound of faint whispers, indistinct, almost like a murmur, coming from somewhere in the house. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. Around midnight, the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the hall or the floor below. They were coming from inside the room. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My breath fogged in the cold air. The fire in the small hearth had gone out, and the room was now freezing. I reached for my flashlight and swept it across the room. That's when I saw them. Handprints. Small, child-sized handprints pressed into the frost on the inside of the window. They hadn't been there before. A chill ran down my spine. I leapt out of bed, threw on my coat, and decided I couldn't stay another minute in that house. As I opened the door to the hallway, I froze. Margaret was standing at the end of the hall, her face half lit by the flickering lantern she held. Her expression was vacant, almost trance-like. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. I need to leave," I stammered. "I just remembered. I have to be somewhere." She tilted her head slightly, as if confused, but didn't say anything. I edged past her, feeling her gaze on me as I descended the stairs. The house seemed darker now, colder. The fire in the living room had gone out as well, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. As I reached the front door, I glanced back and saw Margaret standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, there was something wrong with her eyes. They were dark, hollow, like empty sockets. I bolted out the door and into the snow. The cold was biting, but I didn't care. I ran back toward where I thought my car was, though the storm had nearly buried the road. Behind me, I thought I heard faint laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and echoing through the trees. When I finally found my car, I nearly cried in relief. Miraculously, it started on the first try, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. The next day, I told the story to a local gas station attendant as he filled my tank. He listened quietly, his face pale. "That house," he said, shaking his head. "It burned down over 40 years ago. A family lived there, Margaret and her 2 kids. They say the fire was an accident, but some folks think Margaret started it herself. The kids died in the blaze, but Margaret's body was never found." I felt a cold shiver run through me. I didn't tell him about the tea or the handprints or the laughter. I didn't want to believe it myself. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But every year, when winter rolls around, I think of that house buried in snow and wonder if Margaret is still out there waiting for the next traveler to knock on her door.
Story number 2.
The night was still and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was house-sitting for a friend in the small, isolated town of Elkwood, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and outsiders were few and far between. My friend, Sarah, had left me detailed instructions. Feed her cat, water the plants, and under no circumstances, go into the basement. I had laughed at the note, assuming she was joking, but the seriousness in her tone when she'd handed me the keys lingered in the back of my mind. "It's an old house," she had said, almost as if she was trying to explain something she didn't fully understand. "Weird stuff happens sometimes. Just don't go down there, okay?" It wasn't long before I understood what she meant. The house itself was unnerving, a sprawling Victorian relic with creaky floors, dim lighting, and walls that seemed to groan under the weight of time. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the entire house feel alive. Sarah's cat, Luna, was my only companion. A sleek black feline with piercing green eyes, she followed me everywhere. Sometimes, though, she'd stop suddenly, staring at a corner or a shadow for minutes at a time, her fur bristling. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to typical cat behavior. The first 2 nights were quiet. I spent them bundled up on the couch, reading and trying to ignore the eerie creaks and groans of the house. But on the 3rd night, the noises began. It started with faint scratching sounds, like nails dragging against wood. I figured it was just the old house settling or maybe a raccoon outside. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct, and they weren't coming from outside. They were coming from below, the basement. I tried to ignore it, but the scratching persisted, accompanied by faint whispers. At first I thought I was imagining them, but the more I strained to listen, the clearer they became. It was a soft, rhythmic murmuring, like someone muttering to themselves just out of earshot. Luna hissed, her back arched, and bolted out of the room. My heart raced. I told myself it was just the wind or a draft, but curiosity gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The basement door was at the end of a long hallway. It was old and heavy, the kind of door that seemed to resist being opened. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The scratching stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an oppressive silence. I descended the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of mildew filled my nostrils. At the bottom, I flicked on the light switch, but the single bulb hanging from the ceiling only cast weak, flickering light. The basement was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and other forgotten relics. At first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something odd, a circle drawn in the dust on the floor. It wasn't a perfect circle, and there were strange symbols scrawled around it, as if someone had been trying to replicate something they'd seen in a book. In the center of the circle was a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, but something compelled me to move closer. As I reached out to touch the box, a sudden gust of icy wind blew through the basement, extinguishing the light. I froze in the darkness, my breath visible in the frigid air. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something moving in the shadows. My flashlight was upstairs. Panic set in as the growling grew louder, closer. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my hands outstretched, searching for the railing. Suddenly I felt a hand, cold, clammy, and undeniably human, grip my wrist. I screamed, jerking away, and bolted up the stairs without looking back. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Luna was nowhere to be found, and the house was eerily silent. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the living room, all the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife. I didn't dare sleep, and I certainly didn't go back to the basement. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't coming from the hallway or upstairs. They were coming from inside the walls. I stared at the wall across from me, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer. Then, just as they seemed to stop right behind me, the television turned on by itself, static filling the room. I grabbed my phone to call Sarah, but the line was dead. Desperate, I called the local police, mumbling something about intruders and strange noises. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical, but promised to send someone to check on me. When the police arrived, 2 officers conducted a thorough search of the house. They found no sign of an intruder and no evidence of forced entry. The basement was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The wooden box was gone. The officers exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say much. They told me to lock the doors and call them if anything else happened. As they left, I overheard one of them mutter something to the other about that house. I didn't stick around to find out what he meant. I packed my things, found Luna hiding under the bed, and left the house that same morning. When I called Sarah to explain why I couldn't stay, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I told you not to go into the basement," she said finally, her voice trembling. "What was in that box, Sarah?" I demanded. She hesitated before answering. "I don't know. It came with the house. The previous owners left it behind, and I was too scared to get rid of it. Weird things started happening after I found it. That's why I told you to stay out of the basement." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. All I cared about was putting as much distance between myself and that house as possible. To this day, I don't know what I unleashed or if it followed me. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling and the shadows seem to move on their own, I hear faint whispers, indistinct, almost like a murmur, and I wonder if I ever really left that house behind.
Story number 3.
It was one of those bleak winter nights when the snow seemed to erase the world. The roads were deserted and the streetlights flickered weakly under the weight of the storm. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital, the only car on the winding mountain road that cut through miles of forest. The isolation was suffocating, the silence pressing against my ears like a vice. I was exhausted, but determined to make it home. My headlights carved a narrow path through the swirling snow, and I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow and shadows, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a woman. She wore a thin, tattered dress completely unsuited for the weather, her dark hair hanging limp over her shoulders. She wasn't waving or trying to flag me down. She just stood there, staring at me with an unnerving stillness. Instinct told me to keep driving, but something about her seemed wrong. Against my better judgment, I slowed to a stop and rolled down the window just enough to speak. The bitter cold rushed in, and I shivered. "Are you all right?" I called out. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned to look at me, her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were blue with cold. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I hesitated. Everything about her set off alarm bells in my head, but I couldn't just leave her out there. Reluctantly, I unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, bringing the freezing cold with her. The air seemed heavier, darker as soon as she entered. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I noticed her fingers were red and raw, like she'd been out in the cold for hours. A faint smell of damp earth and decay clung to her, making my stomach turn. I swallowed hard and started driving again, the tires crunching through the snow. The woman didn't say a word, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her presence was oppressive, like a shadow hanging over me. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second I thought I saw something, shifting beneath her skin like ripples on the surface of water. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. "Where can I drop you off?" I asked again, trying to break the silence. "Up ahead," she said finally, her voice flat and emotionless. "There's a house." I nodded, even though I hadn't seen any signs of civilization for miles. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark, snow-covered forest. Minutes passed in silence, and the tension in the car grew unbearable. I could feel her watching me, even though she hadn't turned her head. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance. Relief washed over me. Maybe there really was a house up ahead, and I could drop her off and get back to the safety of my own home. As we got closer, I realized the light was coming from a single window in a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow and the wooden walls weathered and cracked. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled the car to a stop and turned to face her, but the passenger seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. The car door hadn't opened, and there were no footprints in the snow outside. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I should have driven away, but something compelled me to get out of the car. The light in the cabin flickered, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like a moth to a flame. My boots crunched through the snow as I approached the front door, my breath fogging in the icy air. The door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of damp earth and rot was overwhelming. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center and a mirror on the far wall. The light was coming from an oil lamp on the floor, its flame casting long, dancing shadows. I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. As I moved closer to the mirror, I realized it wasn't reflecting the room correctly. Instead, it showed something else entirely, a dark, twisted forest under a blood-red sky. And then I saw her. The woman from the road was standing in the mirror, her face contorted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes were black voids, and her hands pressed against the glass as if she was trying to reach through. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, but I couldn't look away. "Help me," she whispered again, though her mouth didn't move. The lights in the cabin flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic took over, and I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers started then, soft at first, but growing louder, surrounding me. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew into screams, and the sound of scratching filled the air like nails dragging across wood. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned to face the mirror again. She was gone. The glass was cracked, spiderwebbing out from the center. From the cracks, a thick black liquid oozed, dripping onto the floor. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and stretching toward me. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, speeding down the road as fast as the snow would allow. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I parked in front of a diner and sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I called Sarah and told her everything. She was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "I've heard stories about that road," she said, her voice trembling. "People talk about a woman who appears in the snow asking for help. They say if you let her into your car, you'll never make it to your destination." I didn't tell her about the cabin, or the mirror, or the black liquid. I didn't want to think about it any more than I already was. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me that night. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, or hear faint whispers just as I'm drifting off to sleep. And in my rearview mirror, I swear I can see her face, staring back at me with those hollow black eyes.
Story number 4.
It happened 3 years ago, but I still can't shake the memory. I used to work as a delivery driver for a small pharmacy in rural Montana. My shifts were long, the drives lonely, and during winter, the snowstorms made everything more treacherous. One particular night stands out, one I wish I could forget. The roads were slick with ice. the snow falling so heavily that my visibility was limited to just a few feet ahead. I had one last delivery to make, a small package for a customer who lived way out in the woods. I didn't recognize the name, but that wasn't unusual. Our pharmacy catered to a lot of reclusive folks who liked their privacy. The address was printed clearly on the label, but my GPS refused to locate it. Instead, I had to rely on the handwritten directions provided by my boss. I followed them as best as I could, driving deeper into the forest. The paved road gave way to gravel, then dirt. My tires crunched over the frozen ground, and the trees pressed in on either side of me, their skeletal branches clawing at the car. I finally reached the house around 10 p.m. It was an old, two-story structure with peeling paint and broken shutters. The porch light was on, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely illuminated the surrounding snow. I parked the car and grabbed the package, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Something about the house felt wrong. The windows were dark, and there were no signs of life. No footprints in the snow, no tire tracks leading to the driveway. I hesitated, but eventually forced myself to walk up the creaky wooden steps and knock on the door. At first, there was no answer. Just as I was about to leave the package on the porch and go, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, her face partially obscured by the shadows. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her dark eyes seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "You're late," she said, her voice low and rasping. "Sorry," I stammered. "The roads were bad." She didn't respond, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Finally, she extended a hand, her fingers long and bony. I handed her the package, eager to leave. But as I turned to go, she spoke again. "Come inside. It's too cold out." I froze. Something in her tone sent a shiver down my spine, like it wasn't an invitation. It was a command. I glanced back at her, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the darkness behind her. A shadow, too tall and too thin to be human. "No, thank you," I said quickly. "I need to finish my shift." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to grow darker. She stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "Come inside," she repeated. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. "I really have to go," I said, backing away. She didn't try to stop me, but as I hurried down the steps, I heard her laugh. A low, guttural sound that didn't belong in the throat of any human. I didn't look back. I got in my car and sped away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The drive back was worse than the drive there. The snow seemed to fall heavier, the darkness deeper. My headlights barely cut through the storm, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if I was being watched. Then I saw something in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, barely discernible against the swirling snow. But as I glanced back again, it grew clearer. A figure was standing in the middle of the road behind me, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the storm. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the figure didn't disappear. It didn't move, didn't run, just seemed to exist in the periphery of my vision, always there no matter how fast I drove. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, startling me. I picked it up, hoping it was my boss, maybe calling to check in on me. But there was no number on the screen, just a blank caller ID. I answered hesitantly. "Hello?" At first, there was only static, then a voice, low, distorted, and familiar. "You should have come inside." I nearly dropped the phone. My chest tightened, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I hung up and threw the phone onto the passenger seat, my heart racing. My car's headlights flickered, and for a horrifying moment, I thought they would go out completely. The shadow in the rearview mirror seemed to grow closer, though it still didn't move. I don't know how I made it back to the main road. By the time I reached the familiar streets of town, the figure was gone, and the snowstorm had started to let up. I parked in front of the pharmacy, shaking so hard I could barely turn off the engine. The warmth of the building felt like a lifeline as I stumbled inside. My boss was there, counting inventory. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Long night?" he asked. "You could say that," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't want to tell him what had happened. It sounded insane. Instead, I handed him the delivery slip. "Who lives at that address, anyway?" He frowned, taking the slip from me. "That address?" He stared at it for a moment, his face going pale. "That house has been abandoned for years." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What? The last person who lived there died in the 90s, he said. A woman. They say she froze to death during a snowstorm. The body wasn't found until weeks later. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The memory of her hollow eyes and her skeletal hand burned in my mind. My boss must have seen the look on my face because he added, "You didn't go inside, did you?" I shook my head. "No." "Good," he said, "because anyone who doesn't come back." That night, I quit my job. I couldn't go back to driving those lonely roads, not knowing what might be out there. But even now, years later, I still see her sometimes, in the shadows of my room at night, in the foggy reflection of a window, or in the faint static of an empty phone call. And every time I hear her voice, soft and raspy, whispering the same chilling words, "You should have come inside."
Story number 5.
It was during a brutal winter, when the world felt suffocated under a blanket of ice and silence. My uncle owned a remote cabin deep in the forests of Michigan, a place he often escaped to when he needed solitude. When I lost my job, he offered me the cabin to clear my head for a while. Desperate for a change of scenery, I accepted, thinking the isolation would do me good. The drive was treacherous. Snow whipped across the windshield, and the dense forest loomed like a fortress. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. The structure was small but cozy, with a single bedroom, a kitchen, and a wood-burning stove that I lit immediately to chase away the biting cold. That first night, everything seemed normal. The wind howled outside, but the fire kept the chill at bay. I fell asleep quickly, wrapped in layers of blankets. I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the storm. The wind can play tricks on your mind, especially in an unfamiliar place. But these were deliberate, heavy steps crunching through the snow just outside the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I crept to the window and peered out. There was nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows across the snowy clearing, but no footprints marred the pristine surface. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch snapping under the weight of the snow. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I decided to explore the area. The cabin sat near a frozen lake, its surface smooth and eerily reflective. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of towering trees and tangled undergrowth. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Carvings on the trees. Symbols and patterns etched into the bark, weathered but unmistakable. They were arranged in circles, spirals, and jagged lines that didn't seem natural. I felt uneasy but tried to shake it off. Maybe some kids had done it years ago, I told myself. Or perhaps hunters marking trails. Still, the strange carvings stuck in my mind as I returned to the cabin. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, circling the cabin. I held my breath as I listened, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand. The sound stopped at the front door. A heavy, deliberate knock echoed through the small cabin, sending a jolt of fear through me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a low, raspy voice. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. The voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It was just... I stayed frozen in my bed, praying whoever it was would leave. Minutes passed in silence before I finally worked up the courage to move. I tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. No footprints. Nothing. I barely slept that night, every creak of the cabin setting my nerves on edge. By morning, I was ready to leave. The isolation I had craved now felt suffocating. But when I tried to start my car, the engine refused to turn over. I checked my phone. No signal. It seemed I was stuck, at least for another day. I spent the daylight hours chopping wood and trying to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, once serene, now felt menacing. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch set my heart racing. And then I found the footprints. They were just outside the cabin, partially obscured by fresh snow. Large and uneven, like whoever made them was dragging one foot. They led into the woods, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the air growing colder with every step. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath my boots. Eventually, the footprints led to a clearing. In the center was a large tree, its trunk covered in the same strange carvings I'd seen before. But this time there were fresh ones, the lines sharp and clean. A symbol that looked like an eye stared back at me, and beneath it there was something else. A name. My name. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the icy ground. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, the forest a blur around me. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands were trembling as I lit the stove and huddled by the fire, trying to calm my racing heart. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, more insistent. The voice came again, too, more guttural than before. "Let me in." I didn't answer. I didn't move. The knocking turned into pounding, shaking the door on its hinges. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and held it tightly, my back pressed against the wall. The pounding stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the window shattered. I screamed as icy air rushed into the cabin. Something long and pale reached through the broken glass, claw-like fingers grasping at the air. I bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and pushing the dresser against it. My heart felt like it would explode as I heard heavy footsteps moving through the cabin, accompanied by that awful voice. "Let me in." It was closer now, right outside the bedroom door. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching the knife as tears streamed down my face. The doorknob rattled, and the voice turned into a guttural growl. And then, silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded-up window. I emerged cautiously, every nerve on edge. The cabin was empty, but the front door hung open, snow blowing in across the floor. The carvings from the forest were etched into the walls, circling the room like a sinister mural. My car started without issue that morning, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my uncle's house. When I told him what happened, his face went pale. He said the cabin had always been odd, that people often reported strange occurrences there. But he'd never mentioned it before because he didn't believe the stories. I haven't been back to the cabin since. Sometimes, though, on cold winter nights, I hear faint knocking at my door, followed by that same raspy voice. "Let me in."
Story number 6.
It was the dead of winter, and my shift at the old gas station on the outskirts of town had just started. It was the kind of place you'd drive by without noticing, run down, surrounded by dense forest, and usually eerily quiet. Winters in northern Maine were harsh, with snowstorms that seemed to swallow the world whole, leaving everything muffled and gray. That night was no exception. I was alone, as always. The gas station was small, with a single pump and a tiny convenience store that smelled of stale coffee and old rubber. I'd worked there for nearly a year, and while it was dull, it was predictable. But that night was anything but. Around 11:30 p.m., a storm rolled in. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the snow came down in thick, relentless sheets. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to stay awake when the bell above the door jingled. It startled me. I hadn't seen any headlights, and who would be out in weather like this? A man stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. He was tall and gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He didn't say a word, just nodded in my direction and started browsing the shelves. "Hell of a night out there," I said, trying to break the silence. My voice sounded thin in the empty store. He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. Something about him put me on edge. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as he picked up random items, a can of soup, a flashlight, a pack of batteries, and placed them on the counter. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. "Can I pay in cash?" "Of course," I replied, trying to sound normal, but my hands trembled as I rang him up. He handed me a crumpled 20, his fingers icy cold when they brushed mine. As I gave him his change, he leaned in close and whispered something I couldn't quite catch. "Excuse me?" I said, leaning back instinctively. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I watched through the frosted glass as he disappeared into the storm. No car, no footprints, just gone. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he lived nearby and had walked through the woods. It wasn't impossible, though it seemed unlikely in this weather. Still, his presence lingered, a chill that wouldn't leave the air even with the heater cranked up. About an hour later, the power went out. The hum of the fluorescent lights died, plunging the store into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the breaker box in the back room, but when I flipped the switches, nothing happened. The storm must have taken out a line. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the glass. I froze. The front of the store was lined with windows, and in the beam of my flashlight, I could just make out a figure standing outside. My stomach dropped. It was the man from earlier, but something about him was different. He stood perfectly still, his face pressed against the glass, staring at me. "Sir?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Do you need help?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there watching. My instinct screamed at me to lock the door, but as I approached, he was gone. I shone my flashlight into the storm, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no shadow, just the endless swirl of snow. I locked the door anyway and retreated behind the counter, heart pounding. Minutes crawled by, the only sound the wind howling outside. I told myself he was gone, that it was just some drifter looking for shelter. But then the tapping started again, this time at the back door, the storage room. Every hair on my body stood on end. I gripped the flashlight tighter, debating whether to investigate or call the police. But my phone had no signal and the landline was dead. I was completely alone. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I steeled myself and crept toward the storage room, the beam of my flashlight shaking with every step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deep guttural scratching like nails dragging across wood. I threw the door open, the flashlight illuminating the small, cluttered space. It was empty. But then I saw it. Long, deep gouges carved into the wooden doorframe, as if something with claws had tried to force its way in. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, slamming the door shut. That's when the lights flickered back on, bathing the store in an eerie, buzzing glow. For a moment, I felt relief, until I looked at the security monitors. The camera feeds displayed a grainy, black-and-white view of the station's exterior. In every frame, the man stood just outside the building, his face turned toward the camera. His expression was blank, but his eyes burned with an unnatural intensity. And then, as I watched, he moved. Not walked. Moved. 1 second, he was on the far edge of the screen. The next, he was closer, as if he'd skipped forward in time. My stomach churned as I watched him glitch his way toward the entrance. I glanced up at the front door, and my blood ran cold. He was standing there. His face was inches from the glass, lips curled into a grotesque smile. His eyes were wrong, pitch black, like twin voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. He raised a hand and tapped on the glass with one long, crooked finger. "Let me in," he mouthed, though no sound escaped his lips. I backed away, my chest tightening as panic set in. He didn't move, didn't stop smiling. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed behind the counter, clutching the flashlight and the rusty tire iron we kept in the storage room for emergencies. The storm raged on, and every gust of wind felt like a whisper, every creak of the building like a footstep. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a pristine blanket of snow. I cautiously stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The parking lot was empty, and the forest was still. But then I saw them. Footprints. They circled the building, leading from the front door to the back and stopping directly beneath the windows where I'd seen him standing. They were deep, each one larger than any human foot should be, and they didn't lead away. They just ended, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I quit that job the same day. I never went back, and I never told anyone what happened, not fully anyway. But sometimes when the wind howls outside my window, I hear it again, the faint, deliberate tapping of a finger on glass, and I know he's still out there.
Story number 7.
It happened during the winter of 2017, when I worked as a night janitor at an old hospital in upstate New York. The building was massive and outdated, with long, dimly lit hallways that always seemed colder than the outside air. The hospital's West Wing, in particular, was notorious among the staff. It had been shut down years ago, deemed unsafe due to structural issues. But people said it was more than that. Nurses whispered about strange sounds and shadows moving on their own. Even the most rational among us avoided it. But not me. I'd always considered myself a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in ghost stories. That changed after one unforgettable night. The snowstorm was relentless that evening, burying the city under several feet of snow. The hospital was eerily quiet, with fewer patients and only the bare minimum of staff on duty. It was my responsibility to clean the hallways and mop the floors. Around midnight, I started in the main lobby and worked my way toward the eastern side of the building, avoiding the west wing like usual. As I mopped the cold tile floors, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't unusual to feel uneasy in the hospital's quiet hours. There was something inherently unsettling about empty patient rooms and flickering fluorescent lights. But that night, it was different. The shadows seemed to stretch further and the silence felt heavier. I told myself I was imagining things and pressed on. I had just finished cleaning one of the long corridors when the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. I froze, gripping the mop handle tightly, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Just a power surge," I muttered, though my voice betrayed my fear. The emergency lights kicked on seconds later, bathing the hallway in a faint red glow. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the soft squeak of my shoes as I moved toward the supply closet. I planned to grab my flashlight and continue with my work, anything to distract me from the growing unease. As I rounded the corner, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed down the corridor, slow and deliberate, like fingernails drumming on metal. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the west wing. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to ignore it. The wing was closed, sealed off. There shouldn't have been anyone there. But curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way toward the heavy double doors that separated the west wing from the rest of the hospital. The doors creaked loudly as I pushed them open, the sound echoing down the empty hallway beyond. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and broken ceiling tiles. The air was frigid, far colder than the rest of the hospital, and it carried a faint metallic smell, like rust or old blood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Anyone there?" No response. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I told myself I'd look around quickly and leave. Maybe it was a maintenance worker or some stray animal that had gotten inside. Either way, I needed to know. As I walked deeper into the west wing, the sense of unease grew. The rooms were in various states of decay, with rusted bed frames and shattered windows. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move at the end of the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. I turned to leave, deciding I'd seen enough. But as I turned, I heard a loud crash behind me, like metal slamming against the floor. Whipping around, I pointed my flashlight down the hall. One of the patient room doors was ajar, its metal frame hanging crookedly on its hinges. Against every instinct, I approached the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The room beyond was dark, but the flashlight revealed an overturned hospital bed and a scattering of broken glass. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with that same metallic scent. I stepped inside cautiously, shining the light around the room. That's when I saw it, writing on the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood. "Get out!" My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Then I heard it. Whispers. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, overlapping until they became an incoherent cacophony. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stood in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if studying me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, featureless and black. I felt a crushing weight in my chest, a primal terror unlike anything I'd ever known. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure lunged toward me, and I screamed, dropping the flashlight. Everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the floor outside the west wing, with the double doors closed behind me. My head throbbed, and my hands were trembling. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there. The flashlight lay beside me, its beam flickering weakly. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, where one of the nurses found me, pale and shaking. She asked what had happened, but I couldn't explain. I just grabbed my coat and left, leaving the mop bucket and all my supplies behind. I never went back to that hospital. I quit the next day and moved out of town shortly after, but I can't escape what happened that night. Sometimes in the dead of winter, I hear the faint tapping again, echoing in my mind, and I know it's waiting for me.
Story number 8.
It was the winter of 2015, one of the coldest seasons I can remember. I just started a new job as a security guard at a small local college in Pennsylvania. My shifts were always at night, patrolling the old campus while students were tucked away in their dorms. The college was small, but its history ran deep. Many of the buildings were over a century old, built in the late 1800s, and the stories surrounding them weren't exactly cheerful. One building in particular gave me the creeps: Lancaster Hall. It had been closed for years, supposedly for renovations, but everyone knew it was a lie. Rumors floated around that it had once been a dormitory until something terrible happened. No one knew the full story, only that the upper floors were sealed off and students avoided it like the plague. Naturally, my first night alone, my route included Lancaster Hall. It was bitterly cold, the kind of night where the wind cuts through even the thickest jacket. Snowflakes swirled in the air as I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, boots crunching over frozen ground. The rest of the campus was quiet, almost peaceful, but as I approached Lancaster Hall, a strange unease settled over me. The building loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture stark against the snow-covered landscape. The windows were dark, many of them boarded up, and the front door was chained shut. I shined my flashlight over the facade, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I was about to turn away, a movement caught my eye. A shadow flitted across one of the upper windows, too quick for me to make out any details. I froze, heart racing, and trained my flashlight on the window. Nothing, just darkness. Probably just a bird, I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I continued my patrol, circling the building. The snow muffled my footsteps, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old stone walls. As I rounded the back of the building, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the basement was open. I knew for a fact that it had been locked earlier. My supervisor had been clear. No one was supposed to enter Lancaster Hall under any circumstances. I radioed in to report the open door, but the static was thick, and my words were met with silence. Cursing under my breath, I decided to investigate. I told myself it was probably just a student sneaking in for a dare, but the icy grip of fear clenched my chest as I descended the narrow steps. The basement smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic like rusted iron. My flashlight beam wavered over crumbling brick walls and old rotting furniture. The air was freezing, colder than outside, and my breath came out in white puffs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the damp walls. No response. I ventured deeper, the sound of dripping water the only thing breaking the silence. As I turned a corner, my flashlight landed on a set of old wooden stairs leading up. The stairs were worn and splintered, and the faintest footprints marred the dust covering them. Someone was here. "Hey, this is private property," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. Still nothing. I climbed the stairs cautiously, every creak making my heart pound harder. At the top, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in long strips, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Doors lined the hallway, each one slightly ajar. I shone my flashlight into the first room. It was empty, save for a broken bed frame and a shattered mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The second room was the same. By the time I reached the third, I was beginning to think I'd imagined the shadow. Then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the end of the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. It was soft, almost like a child's voice, but I couldn't make out the words. My hands shook as I raised the flashlight and started walking toward the sound. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The whispering stopped. I reached the last door, which was slightly more open than the others. Pushing it open with the tip of my flashlight, I stepped inside. The room was empty, but something about it felt wrong. The walls were covered in graffiti, strange symbols I didn't recognize. The air was heavy, and I struggled to breathe. As I scanned the room, my flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something in the corner, a figure hunched over, facing the wall. My flashlight died completely. I fumbled with it, my fingers numb from the cold. When the beam finally came back on, the figure was gone. I bolted out of the room, heart pounding. The hallway felt longer now, stretching endlessly as I sprinted toward the stairs. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing all around me. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, dozens of them, overlapping in a sinister chorus. "Get out," they hissed. "Get out before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I practically fell down the stairs, stumbling through the basement and out into the snow. I didn't stop running until I was back in the main security office, slamming the door behind me. My supervisor was there, sipping coffee and looking bored. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. "Lancaster Hall," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "There's someone in there." His expression changed instantly. He set his coffee down and stared at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "You went inside?" he asked. "The basement door was open," I said. "I heard whispers. Saw." "You didn't see anything," he interrupted sharply. "You're lucky to be standing here right now. Do yourself a favor and don't go near that building again." I tried to press him for answers, but he refused to say anything more. Over the next few days, I learned what I could from other staff. The rumors were worse than I'd imagined. Back in the 1950s, a group of students had performed some kind of ritual in Lancaster Hall. No one knew the details, but whatever they did, it ended in tragedy. 2 of them died under mysterious circumstances, and the survivors refused to speak about it. Since then, the building had been plagued by strange occurrences. I never set foot in Lancaster Hall again. But sometimes, during the quiet hours of my shift, I'd hear faint whispers carried on the wind, always coming from the direction of that cursed building, and I'd wonder if I'd truly left it behind.
Story number 9.
It was the winter of 2009, and I was living alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had rented the place to get away from the city and focus on my writing, but isolation turned out to be lonelier than I'd anticipated. The nearest neighbor was about 3 miles away, and the single dirt road leading to the cabin was often buried under several feet of snow. Still, I told myself I'd adapt. I didn't need much, just my laptop, a few books, and a steady supply of firewood. The first few weeks were uneventful. I wrote during the day and spent my evenings curled up by the fireplace, listening to the wind howl outside. The snow piled higher each day, transforming the woods into a silent, white abyss. It was peaceful, at least at first. One night, as I was writing, I heard a faint knock at the door. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., and frowned. Nobody ever came out this far, especially not in the middle of a snowstorm. Curious but cautious, I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and walked to the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The knock came again, slightly louder this time, sending a chill down my spine. I hesitated before calling out. "Who's there?" No answer. I opened the door just enough to shine my flashlight outside. Snowflakes swirled in the air and the wind bit at my face. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. Shaking my head, I shut the door and locked it. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch hitting the cabin, but my nerves were rattled. I double-checked the windows, ensuring everything was secure before returning to my desk. That was when I noticed it. The words, "Let me in," written in the condensation on the window near the fireplace. My heart nearly stopped. I hadn't written it, and I hadn't seen anyone outside. I rushed to the window and wiped the words away, peering into the dark woods beyond. Still nothing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd written it earlier and forgotten. Maybe it was a prank, though I had no idea how anyone could have made it out here unnoticed. I forced myself to sit back down and focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 2 a.m., I decided to call it a night. As I climbed into bed, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from the living room. It was slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Every hair on my body stood on end. Grabbing the flashlight again, I crept toward the sound. The living room was empty, the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. The scratching stopped as soon as I entered. I scanned the room, shining the beam of light across the windows and furniture. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it earlier. Swallowing my fear, I shut the door and slid the bolt into place. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening for any sign of movement outside, but all I heard was the wind. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a faulty lock. I headed back to bed, though I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, ready for anything. The next morning, I decided to check the area around the cabin. The storm had subsided and the fresh snow was untouched, except for a single set of footprints leading to the back door. They were deep and distinct, larger than any shoe I'd ever seen. They stopped at the door and didn't lead away. My stomach churned as I followed them, half expecting to find someone hiding nearby. But the tracks ended abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, made them had vanished into thin air. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something was watching me from the trees. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on my writing, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints and the words on the window. When night fell, I locked every door and window, checked them twice, and kept the fireplace blazing to stave off the cold and my growing paranoia. At around midnight, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I froze in my chair, heart hammering in my chest. The sound didn't come from the front door, though. It was coming from the window near the kitchen. I turned off the lights, hoping whoever it was would think I wasn't home. Slowly, I crept toward the window, keeping low to the ground. The knocking stopped as I approached, and I dared to peek through the curtains. A face stared back at me. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin, revealing rows of sharp, yellow teeth. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I scrambled to my feet and looked again, the face was gone. I locked myself in the bedroom, barricading the door with a chair. My phone had no signal and the landline was dead. I felt trapped, helpless. Outside, the wind howled louder than ever, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin's walls. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was relentless. The footsteps stopped above the bedroom, directly over my head. I held my breath, straining to listen. A low, guttural voice whispered through the ceiling. "Let me in," I screamed, throwing open the window and climbing out into the snow. The cold burned my skin, but I didn't care. I ran blindly into the woods, the flashlight bouncing in my hand. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I never went back to the cabin. The owner called me a week later, saying he'd found the place trashed, furniture overturned, windows shattered, and strange symbols carved into the walls. He wanted me to pay for the damages, but I refused. Whatever was in that cabin wasn't human, and it wasn't something I could fight. To this day, I don't know what it wanted, but I'll never forget the face in the window or the voice on the roof. Sometimes when the wind howls in the dead of winter, I hear it again.